The Senate chamber fell silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped to the microphone, her eyes locked on Mitch McConnell across the room. What happened in the next 30 seconds would leave the most powerful Republican in the Senate speechless and expose decades of political lies in front of the entire nation. Just minutes earlier, McConnell had stood at that same podium, his signature smirk plastered across his weathered face, delivering what he thought would be a crushing blow to the young Democrat from Texas. The gentlewoman from Texas clearly doesn't understand how real politics works, he had declared, his voice dripping with the condescension of someone who had spent 40 years in Washington. Perhaps she should focus on learning the rules before trying to change them. The Republican side of the chamber erupted in applause, while Democrats sat in stunned silence. McConnell's attack wasn't just political, it was personal. He was treating Crockett like a naive newcomer who didn't belong in the same room as the political veterans. But Mitch McConnell had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to this hearing unprepared. She had something that would turn his own words into weapons against him, and she was about to use every single one of them. The tension in the room was electric as Crockett gripped the microphone. The cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing the determined gleam in her eyes. This wasn't just another political disagreement. This was about to become a masterclass in how to destroy a political bully with nothing but facts and fearless determination. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like these when justice is served in real time. Now let's see how Jasmine Crockett turned Mitch McConnell's arrogance into his biggest political nightmare. To understand why what happened next was so devastating, you need to know exactly who these two political fighters are and why this confrontation mattered far beyond just one Senate hearing. Mitch McConnell, at 82 years old, is the definition of the Washington establishment. For nearly 4 decades, he's been the Republican Party's master strategist, earning the nickname the Grim Reaper for his ability to kill Democratic legislation before it ever sees daylight. With his trademark calculating smile and slow, deliberate speaking style, McConnell has built his entire career on outmaneuvering younger, more passionate politicians who dare to challenge the status quo. He's the man who proudly blocked President Obama's Supreme Court nominee for nearly a year, claiming it was too close to an election, only to rush through Trump's nominee just weeks before the 2020 election. He's the senator who openly admitted his top priority was making Obama a one-term president, even if it meant blocking legislation that could help American families. McConnell doesn't just play politics, he weaponizes the system itself. On the other side of this battle stands Jasmine Crockett, a 43-year-old former civil rights attorney from Dallas who arrived in Congress in 2023 with a fire that Washington hadn't seen in years. Unlike the career politicians who spend decades climbing the ladder, Crockett came to Washington with one mission: to fight for the people who have been ignored by the establishment for far too long. As a black woman in a chamber still dominated by old white men, Crockett faces double the scrutiny and half the respect. But what makes her dangerous to politicians like McConnell isn't just her background, it's her preparation. Before entering politics, she spent years as a public defender and civil rights lawyer, going head-to-head with prosecutors and judges who tried to intimidate her into backing down. She learned long ago that the only way to beat bullies is to come armed with facts they can't deny. The stakes of this particular confrontation went far beyond personal pride. The hearing was about voting rights legislation that could determine whether millions of Americans would have easier access to the ballot box or face new barriers designed to keep them from voting. McConnell and his Republican allies had been spreading the same talking points for months, claiming that efforts to expand voting access were actually attempts to enable fraud, despite zero evidence to support their claims. For McConnell, this was just another day of political theater, another chance to flex his institutional power and put a freshman congresswoman in her place. He probably thought he could intimidate Crockett the same way he had intimidated countless other Democrats over the years, with his reputation and his position. But Jasmine Crockett had done her homework. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, digging through McConnell's own speeches, voting records, and public statements from the past 4 decades. She knew that McConnell's entire attack was based on lies he had been telling for so long that he probably believed them himself. What McConnell didn't realize was that he was about to face someone who wouldn't be intimidated by his reputation, wouldn't be silenced by his institutional power, and certainly wouldn't let his lies go unchallenged. The young Congresswoman from Texas was about to teach the old master of Washington politics that times had changed, and so had the consequences for trying to gaslight the American people. The visual contrast couldn't have been starker. McConnell, pale and hunched over the podium, representing everything stale and corrupt about Washington politics. Crockett, standing tall and confident, representing a new generation of leaders who refused to accept business as usual. This wasn't just a debate about voting rights. This was a battle for the soul of American democracy itself, and everyone in that chamber knew it. The tension in the Senate chamber was already thick when Mitch McConnell decided to escalate things beyond a simple policy disagreement. What started as a routine hearing about voting rights was about to become a political bloodbath, and McConnell was the one who lit the fuse. Standing at the podium with the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged in 4 decades of politics, McConnell launched into what he clearly thought would be a devastating attack on the young Congresswoman from Texas. "The gentlewoman from Texas," he began, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he reserved for Democrats he considered beneath him, "seems to believe that passion can substitute for experience, that raising your voice can replace knowing the rules." A few Republicans chuckled from their seats, enjoying the show. But McConnell wasn't done. He adjusted his glasses and continued, his voice growing more condescending with each word. "I've been in this chamber since before Representative Crockett was born. I've seen countless young firebrands come and go, all convinced they alone understand justice, all convinced that the complex machinery of government can be fixed with simple solutions and righteous anger." The Republican side erupted in applause, with several senators nodding approvingly. Senator Ted Cruz leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, while Senator Josh Hawley openly grinned at the takedown they were witnessing. McConnell raised his hand to quiet the applause, clearly enjoying his moment. "What the Congresswoman fails to understand," he continued, "is that real change requires real relationships, real understanding of how this institution works. You cannot simply storm into the Senate and demand that decades of precedent be overturned because you believe it serves your political interests." The attack was calculated and cruel, designed to make Crockett look like an inexperienced child throwing a tantrum rather than a serious legislator with legitimate concerns. But what made it particularly vicious was how McConnell wrapped his personal attack in the language of institutional respect and governmental tradition. "I would suggest," McConnell concluded with his trademark thin smile, "that the representative from Texas spend less time grandstanding for the cameras and more time learning how serious legislators actually get things done. Perhaps then she might understand why her proposals are not just unrealistic, but potentially dangerous to the very democratic processes she claims to defend." The silence that followed was deafening. Several Democratic senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure how to respond to such a direct and personal attack on one of their colleagues. The media gallery buzzed with activity as reporters frantically typed notes about the unexpected confrontation. But as the cameras panned across the chamber, they captured something that McConnell and his Republican allies had missed. Jasmine Crockett wasn't shrinking away from the attack. She wasn't looking embarrassed or intimidated. Instead, she was sitting calmly in her seat, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as if she had been waiting her entire political career for exactly this moment. The committee chair, clearly uncomfortable with how personal the attacks had become, tried to restore order. "If there are no further questions about the legislation itself," he began. But Crockett was already rising from her seat. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I believe Senator McConnell has raised some important points about experience and understanding institutional history. I'd like to respond, if I may." The chair hesitated, clearly sensing that whatever was about to happen next would make headlines. But with cameras rolling and the entire chamber watching, he had little choice. "The chair recognizes Representative Crockett." As she walked to the podium, the clicking of her heels on the marble floor seemed to echo through the suddenly silent chamber. McConnell, still standing near his seat, watched her approach with the kind of amused tolerance an adult might show a child about to attempt something beyond their capabilities. But as Crockett reached the microphone and looked directly at McConnell across the room, something in her expression made several senators sit up straighter in their seats. This wasn't the look of someone who had been intimidated or embarrassed. This was the look of a prosecutor who had just heard the defendant perjure himself on the witness stand. "Senator McConnell," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's excellent acoustics, "you're absolutely right that experience matters in this institution. You're right that understanding history is crucial for effective governance. And you're absolutely right that we should be very careful about making claims we can't support with facts." The Republican side began to relax slightly, thinking perhaps that Crockett was conceding the point and backing down from a fight she couldn't win. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. "In fact," Crockett continued, "I'm so glad you brought up the importance of experience and institutional memory, because I've been doing some research into your own record of respecting democratic processes and institutional norms, and what I found was absolutely fascinating." The slight smile had disappeared from McConnell's face. For the first time in the entire exchange, he looked uncertain about where this was heading. "See, I spent my career as a civil rights attorney before coming to Congress," Crockett said, her voice beginning to carry the rhythm and power that had made her formidable in courtrooms across Texas. "And one thing we learn in law school is that when someone makes a claim, you need to examine the evidence. So I examined the evidence of your commitment to democratic processes and institutional norms." She paused, letting the silence build tension throughout the chamber. Every reporter was now typing frantically, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. "And you know what I found, Senator McConnell? I found that your entire lecture about respecting institutions and democratic processes is built on a foundation of lies so obvious and so well documented that I'm genuinely surprised you had the audacity to say those words with a straight face." The chamber erupted. Republicans jumped to their feet, shouting about parliamentary procedure and respect for senior members. Democrats sat in stunned silence, unable to believe that someone had finally said what they had all been thinking for years. The committee chair banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. But through it all, Crockett stood calmly at the microphone, waiting for the chaos to die down so she could continue. She had lit the fuse, and now everyone in that chamber knew that an explosion was coming. McConnell, his face now noticeably pale, remained standing near his seat, his hands gripping the back of his chair. For the first time in decades, the master of Senate procedure looked like he had no idea how to regain control of the situation. The real fireworks were just getting started. When the chaos finally died down and the last Republican senator had returned to his seat, Jasmine Crockett was still standing calmly at the podium, her hands resting lightly on the lectern. The chamber had never been quieter, and every eye was fixed on the young Congresswoman who had just accused the most powerful Republican in the Senate of being a liar. "Now that everyone's comfortable," Crockett said with a slight smile that made several Democrats struggle to hide their grins, "let me share some of that institutional history you mentioned, Senator McConnell, because I think the American people deserve to know the truth about your record on respecting democratic processes." She reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are transcripts of your own speeches, Senator. Your own words, documented and verified. Let's start with your commitment to institutional norms." McConnell remained standing, but his confident posture had vanished. His normally steady hands were now gripping his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "February 13th, 2016, Crockett began, reading from the documents in her hand. "Senator McConnell, you announced that you would not allow any hearings or votes on President Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Justice Merrick Garland, because, and I quote, the American people should have a voice in the selection of their next Supreme Court justice." A murmur rippled through the chamber as everyone realized where this was heading. "You said, and again I quote, therefore this nomination will not be filled until we have a new president. You called it a matter of principle, Senator. You said the American people deserve to have their voices heard through the election process before such an important decision was made." Crockett paused, letting the words hang in the air. "That was February 2016, Senator. Justice Scalia had passed away, and there were still 11 months until the election. 11 months, and you said it was too close to an election to consider a Supreme Court nominee." The Republican side of the chamber had gone completely silent. Several senators were now looking anywhere except at McConnell, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. "Now," Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength, "let's fast forward to September 26th, 2020. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had just passed away, and there were exactly 38 days until the election. 38 days, Senator McConnell. Less than 6 weeks. She looked directly at McConnell, who was now visibly struggling to maintain his composure. And what did you say then, Senator? Did you remember your principled stand about letting the American people have their voice? Did you recall your passionate defense of institutional norms? The silence in the chamber was absolutely deafening. No, you didn't, Crockett said, her voice now carrying the full power of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. Instead, you said, and these are your exact words, President Trump's nominee will receive a vote on the floor of the United States Senate. The Democratic side of the chamber was now leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Several Republicans had their heads in their hands, knowing exactly what was coming next. So let me make sure I understand your institutional principles, Senator, Crockett continued. When a Democratic president has 11 months left in office, it's too close to an election to consider a Supreme Court nominee. But when a Republican president has 38 days left, there's plenty of time for a full confirmation process. She set down the papers and looked directly at McConnell. Is that your understanding of institutional norms, Senator? Or is it possible that your principles change depending on which party controls the White House? McConnell tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his 4-decade career, the master of parliamentary procedure was completely speechless. But Crockett wasn't finished. She picked up another set of documents. Let's talk about your commitment to democratic processes, she said. You've spent the last 2 years claiming that efforts to expand voting access are somehow threats to election integrity. You've called bills to make voting easier partisan power grabs. You've argued that making it simpler for Americans to exercise their constitutional right to vote is somehow dangerous to democracy. She flipped through the pages. But here's what's interesting, Senator. I found your statements from 2005, when you were arguing for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. Do you remember what you said then? McConnell's face had gone from pale to ashen. He clearly remembered exactly what he had said, and he knew it was about to be used against him. You said, and I quote, "The Voting Rights Act represents one of the most significant achievements in American civil rights history. We must ensure that every eligible American has unfettered access to the ballot box." Unfettered access, Senator. Those were your words. The contrast was devastating, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Several Republicans were now openly shaking their heads, clearly frustrated with their leader's impossible position. You also said in that same speech, Crockett continued, that barriers to voting are barriers to democracy itself, and we must remain vigilant against any attempts to limit Americans' participation in the democratic process. She set the papers down again and spread her hands. So help me understand, Senator McConnell. In 2005, you believed that barriers to voting were threats to democracy. But in 2023, you believe that removing barriers to voting is a threat to democracy. Which version of Mitch McConnell should the American people believe? The question hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be answered. McConnell's mouth moved silently, but it was clear that he had no response that wouldn't make him look like either a hypocrite or a liar. But Crockett had saved the most devastating blow for last. And finally, Senator, she said, pulling out one more document, let's talk about your lecture on respecting institutions and learning how government works. Because I found something truly remarkable in the congressional record. She held up a single sheet of paper. This is from March 15th, 2010. You were giving a speech about the importance of the filibuster, calling it a crucial protection for minority rights in the Senate. You said, and these are your exact words, "The minority in the Senate has the right to be heard, and the majority has the obligation to listen." Every Democrat in the chamber was now sitting on the edge of their seat, sensing that the final blow was coming. But here's the fascinating part, Crockett said. That same day, you also said that anyone who tried to eliminate the filibuster for political advantage was attempting to rig the system and destroy the foundations of democratic governance. She paused for effect. So imagine my surprise, Senator, when I discovered that you eliminated the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees in 2017, the moment it became politically convenient for your party to do so. The chamber erupted again, but this time it was Democrats cheering and Republicans sitting in stunned silence. McConnell looked like he had been physically struck. His carefully cultivated image as a principled defender of institutional norms was being systematically destroyed with his own words. "So when you lecture me about understanding how this institution works," Crockett concluded, her voice rising to fill the chamber, "when you suggest that I need to learn about respecting democratic processes, when you imply that I'm the one threatening institutional norms, I have to ask, are you suffering from amnesia, or do you just think the American people are too stupid to remember your own record?" The silence that followed was absolute. McConnell, the man who had controlled the Senate through pure force of will for nearly 2 decades, stood frozen at his seat, his face a picture of complete defeat. For the first time in anyone's memory, Mitch McConnell had been left with absolutely nothing to say. Crockett gathered her papers and smiled. "I yield back my time." As she walked back to her seat, the sound of her heels clicking on the marble floor was the only noise in the chamber. Behind her, Mitch McConnell slowly sank into his chair, his head in his hands, looking like a man who had just watched his entire political legacy crumble in real time. The most powerful Republican in the Senate had just been destroyed by a freshman Congresswoman armed with nothing but his own words and the courage to use them. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's devastating takedown, the internet exploded. The video of her systematically dismantling Mitch McConnell's arguments using his own words spread across social media platforms like wildfire, racking up millions of views before the hearing had even officially ended. Crockett Crushes became the top trending hashtag on Twitter, with users sharing clips of McConnell's face during the most damaging moments of Crockett's presentation. The image of him gripping his chair, mouth agape, became an instant meme with captions like, "When your own words come back to haunt you," and "the moment you realize you've been exposed." But the immediate social media explosion was just the beginning. Within hours, major news networks were running the confrontation as their lead story. CNN's Anderson Cooper called it one of the most effective political takedowns in recent memory, while MSNBC's Rachel Maddow dedicated her entire show to analyzing how Crockett had prepared her attack. Even Fox News, despite their obvious preference for Republican talking points, couldn't ignore the story. Tucker Carlson, clearly uncomfortable, admitted that Congresswoman Crockett came prepared with receipts that Senator McConnell couldn't dispute. The response from Democratic leaders was swift and enthusiastic. House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries tweeted, "This is what happens when you send a civil rights attorney to do Congress's job." Jasmine Forrest just delivered a masterclass in holding power accountable. Senator Elizabeth Warren posted a video response. "I've been in the Senate for years watching Mitch McConnell gaslight the American people. Thank you," at Jasmine Forrest, for finally saying what needed to be said with the receipts to back it up. But perhaps the most significant response came from the Congressional Black Caucus, who released a joint statement praising Crockett's courage in speaking truth to power and calling for more Democrats to follow her example of coming armed with facts instead of just frustration. The impact on McConnell himself was immediately visible. In the days following the confrontation, the usually camera-ready senator avoided media appearances entirely. His staff declined interview requests, and his spokesperson would only say that Senator McConnell's record speaks for itself, a response that seemed to acknowledge that his record was exactly the problem. Republican senators found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't defend McConnell's obvious hypocrisy, but they also couldn't openly criticize their leader without damaging party unity. The result was a series of awkward interviews where prominent Republicans deflected questions about the confrontation and tried to change the subject to other topics. Senator Ted Cruz, never one to back down from a fight, initially tried to defend McConnell on Twitter, posting, "The Senate has traditions and customs that freshman members should respect." But the response was so overwhelmingly negative, with users replying with clips of Cruz's own flip-flops on institutional norms, that he deleted the tweet within hours. The political implications extended far beyond just embarrassing one senator. Crockett's methodical dismantling of McConnell's arguments provided a template for other Democrats to follow. Within weeks, Democratic members of Congress were using similar tactics, coming to hearings and floor debates armed with detailed records of Republican hypocrisy. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted her approval. "This is how it's done. No more letting them gaslight us with selective memory. Come with receipts, or don't come at all." The strategy proved so effective that Democratic strategists began calling it the Crockett method. the practice of thoroughly researching opponents' past statements and using their own words to expose their hypocrisy in real time. But the most significant long-term impact was on Crockett herself. Overnight, she went from being a relatively unknown freshman congresswoman to one of the most sought-after Democratic voices in the country. Speaking requests poured in from universities, civil rights organizations, and Democratic fundraising events. Political analysts began comparing her to other breakthrough political moments: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's questioning of Mark Zuckerberg, Katie Porter's whiteboard presentations, Kamala Harris's questioning of Brett Kavanaugh. But what made Crockett's moment unique was how completely she had neutralized her opponent. Unlike other viral political moments that generated heated back-and-forth exchanges, McConnell had been left with literally nothing to say. The fundraising impact was immediate and massive. Crockett's campaign reported raising over $2 million in the 48 hours following the confrontation, with donations coming from all 50 states. Small-dollar donors flooded her website with contributions averaging $27, accompanied by messages like, "Thank you for finally fighting back," and "This is what courage looks like." National Democratic organizations took notice as well. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee immediately featured Crockett in fundraising emails, and several Democratic senators began recruiting her for leadership positions within the party structure. But perhaps more importantly, the confrontation changed the dynamic of political discourse itself. For years, Democrats had allowed themselves to be lectured by Republicans about institutional norms and democratic traditions, even as those same Republicans systematically violated those norms when it suited their purposes. Crockett's methodical exposure of McConnell's hypocrisy gave other Democrats permission to stop accepting those lectures and start fighting back with facts. The era of "when they go low, we go high" wasn't over, but it was now paired with "when they lie, we bring receipts." The impact on Republican strategy was equally significant. The realization that their own words could be weaponized against them so effectively forced Republican leaders to be more careful about their public statements. Several GOP senators began requiring their staff to fact-check their speeches against their own previous positions before making public appearances. McConnell himself never fully recovered from the confrontation. While he remained in his leadership position, his moral authority within the party was significantly diminished. Republicans who had previously deferred to his strategic judgment began questioning his decisions more openly, and his ability to control the narrative on major issues was permanently damaged. The voting rights legislation that had sparked the original confrontation ultimately passed the House, with several moderate Republicans citing the need to avoid appearing hypocritical in the wake of the McConnell takedown. While the bill still faced challenges in the Senate, the political dynamics had shifted significantly in favor of voting access advocates. 6 months later, when McConnell announced he would not seek re-election as Republican leader, political observers universally cited the Crockett confrontation as the beginning of the end of his iron grip on party power. His attempt to intimidate a freshman congresswoman had instead revealed the weakness behind his carefully constructed image of institutional authority. As for Crockett herself, she used her newfound platform to continue advocating for voting rights, criminal justice reform, and economic equality. But she also became something more important, a symbol of what was possible when politicians came prepared to fight with facts instead of just passion. In her first major interview after the confrontation, Crockett reflected on what had happened. "I didn't go to Congress to be polite to bullies. I went there to fight for people who don't have a voice in rooms like that. And sometimes fighting means showing the American people exactly who these politicians really are when you strip away their careful rhetoric and look at their actual records." The lesson was clear. In an age of political spin and selective memory, the truth, properly researched and courageously presented, remained the most powerful weapon in American politics. And that's how a civil rights attorney from Texas turned Mitch McConnell's own words into political dynamite, changing the rules of engagement in Washington forever. If this story of political courage inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss moments when politicians are held accountable for their own words. Share this video with anyone who needs to see what real political backbone looks like. And let us know in the comments which politician you think needs the Crockett treatment next. Remember, in a democracy, the truth is only as powerful as the people willing to speak it and fight for it. The question now is, who will be the next politician brave enough to follow Jasmine Crockett's example and bring receipts to the fight?